A single mom will never be fully committed to her job. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest, 8 years of 60-hour weeks and perfect performance reviews vaporizing in a single sentence designed to justify the unjustifiable. I sat in that glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of Morrison & Associates, watching my boss deliver my termination with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd never had to choose between a sick child and a board meeting. The Seattle skyline stretched beyond those windows like a promise of freedom I couldn't afford to accept. Your priorities are divided, he continued, shuffling papers that would erase me from the firm like I'd never existed. We need team members who can commit fully to our clients' needs. My daughter Emma's finger-painted artwork still hung on my cubicle wall. Her school pickup was in 4 hours. The rent was due in 6 days. But what he didn't know, what none of them could see behind my exhausted eyes and discount blazer, was that firing me wasn't just terminating an employee. He was awakening something far more dangerous than a desperate woman with nothing left to lose. My name is Scarlett Hayes. I'm 37 years old, single mother of a 7-year-old daughter, and today I was told that motherhood makes me disposable. Not unfit, not incompetent, not lacking in qualifications or dedication, or the kind of expertise that takes 8 years to build in the unforgiving world of corporate law. Disposable, like a coffee cup you use once and throw away when it no longer serves your convenience. Morrison & Associates occupied floors 28 through 34 of the Columbia Center in downtown Seattle, all steel and glass that reflected the ambition of a firm that billed $800 an hour for legal advice and paid their associates just enough to afford the student loans that had bought them the privilege of working 80-hour weeks. The termination happened in Conference Room B, a sterile space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Elliott Bay and furniture that probably cost more than I'd made in my first year out of law school. Gray walls, gray carpet, gray faces delivering news that would leave my life in ruins while they went home to wives who didn't have to choose between career advancement and pediatrician appointments. My boss, Robert Morrison, grandson of the firm's founder and beneficiary of the kind of inherited mediocrity that gets passed down like genetic disorders, sat across from me with HR Representative Janet Kim, both of them wearing expressions that suggested they were performing a distasteful but necessary function. Your priorities have become incompatible with our firm's expectations, Morrison had said, shuffling papers like he was dealing cards in a game I'd never been taught the rules for. Single mothers face unique challenges that make full commitment to client needs difficult. 8 years of my life. Nights I'd stayed until midnight reviewing contracts while Emma slept in the daycare down the hall. Weekends I'd missed playground dates and birthday parties to prepare for depositions that built Morrison's reputation, while my own remained invisible. The walk back to my cubicle felt like a funeral procession. Gray cubicles stretched in rows like tombstones, each one occupied by colleagues who suddenly found their computer screens fascinating when I passed. Their eyes slid away like water off glass, afraid that making eye contact might contaminate them with whatever disease had made me expendable. Nobody spoke. Nobody offered sympathy or outrage or even the basic human decency of acknowledging that what had just happened was wrong. They were all too afraid that compassion might cost them their own paychecks, their own health insurance, their own precarious positions in a system designed to pit survival against solidarity. But as I packed my personal items into a cardboard box that had once held copier paper, my mind drifted to another moment in another sterile room, 13 years earlier. I was 24, 6 months pregnant with Emma, sitting in my obstetrician's office when Janet Kim had called to clarify the firm's maternity leave policy, unpaid time off. No guarantee that my position would be available when I returned. Whispered conversations about whether pregnancy indicated a lack of long-term commitment to the practice of law. I'd fought back then, threatened to file discrimination complaints, reminded them that pregnancy was not a career-ending medical condition. They'd backed down, barely, giving me the minimum legally required accommodations while making it clear that motherhood was a professional liability I'd chosen to inflict upon myself. The memory sharpened something inside me like a blade being honed on stone. I thought about Emma, my daughter with hair the color of Seattle sunshine, who asked me every night at bedtime, "Mom, why do you look so tired?" Her 7-year-old eyes reflected a wisdom that came from watching her mother sacrifice everything for a job that valued neither her contribution nor her humanity. I thought about my ex-husband Derek, who'd contributed exactly nothing to this equation except sperm and a pattern of excuses that justified his absence from every school play, every sick day, every moment when being a parent required inconvenience or sacrifice. He'd walked away when Emma turned 2, leaving behind child support payments that arrived sporadically and explanations that arrived never. But mostly I thought about my mother, who'd driven down from Spokane when she heard the news. Arriving at my apartment with homemade soup and the kind of quiet strength that comes from women who've survived worse betrayals. "Every empire starts with one brave woman," she'd whispered while Emma slept between us on the couch, her small body warm against our combined determination. "The question is whether you're going to be that woman." As I walked out of Morrison and Associates for the last time, my cardboard box clutched against my chest like armor, I felt something crystallize in my throat like ice forming around fire. They thought they were ending my career, eliminating a complication that interfered with their profit margins and golf handicaps. What they'd actually done was wake up something far more dangerous than a desperate single mother with nothing left to lose. They'd awakened a woman who understood exactly how the system was broken and had nothing preventing her from fixing it. The elevator doors closed behind me with the finality of a coffin lid, sealing away 8 years of believing that competence and dedication would eventually be rewarded by people who measured human worth in billable hours and client satisfaction scores. But as I stepped out into the Seattle afternoon, gray sky threatening rain that never seemed to stop, I realized that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Morrison and Associates had just created their own worst enemy, a woman with legal training, personal motivation, and enough righteous fury to fuel a revolution. They'd fired me for being a mother. Now I was going to make sure no other woman would ever face that choice again. The unemployment benefits lasted exactly 12 weeks, long enough to realize that the safety net everyone talks about is made of tissue paper and false promises. My apartment in Capitol Hill felt smaller every day, the walls closing in like a vice made of unpaid bills and unanswered job applications. The kitchen table where Emma did her homework was buried under past due notices that arrived with the regularity of a death sentence. Rent, utilities, student loans, credit cards I'd maxed out trying to keep us afloat between my last paycheck and whatever came next. Emma sat at that same table, her blonde hair falling across her face as she colored another princess picture, her 7-year-old voice cutting through my financial panic with the kind of innocence that makes adult failures feel like war crimes. "Mommy, will we still have a Christmas tree this year?" The question hit me like a physical blow. It was October 15th. Christmas was 2 months away, and I was calculating whether we could afford both electricity and groceries, let alone holiday decorations that would remind us of what normal families could take for granted. "Of course, sweetheart," I lied, my voice steady despite the fact that I was mentally calculating whether the pawn shop would give me enough for my law school ring to cover December rent. But it was later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed elephant her father had given her before he disappeared into a cloud of excuses and missed support payments, that the breaking point finally came. I sat on my secondhand couch, surrounded by job rejection letters that might as well have been death certificates, and started to cry. Not the gentle tears of disappointment, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone who'd fought so hard for so long that she'd forgotten what surrender felt like. That's when Robert Morrison's words came back to me, echoing in the silence of my failing life like a curse designed to become prophecy. A single mom will never be fully committed to her job. The tears stopped, just stopped, like someone had turned off a faucet. Because suddenly I wasn't crying about my own failure anymore. I was furious about a system that made my failure inevitable, that punished women for the biological reality of pregnancy and the social necessity of caring for children. I was angry at every job interview where I'd been asked about my family plans like motherhood was a contagious disease that might interfere with profit margins. Angry at every workplace that offered flexibility, as long as that flexibility meant working twice as hard for half the recognition. Angry at a legal system that I'd spent 8 years serving, only to discover it had no interest in protecting people like me. The next morning, I walked 12 blocks to the campaign office for Maria Santos, who was running for Seattle City Council on a platform that included affordable childcare and workplace protections for parents. The office was a converted storefront in the University District, all peeling paint and folding chairs, but it buzzed with the kind of energy that comes from people who believe they can actually change things. The volunteer coordinator was a college student named Tyler, who looked like he'd learned everything he knew about politics from watching The West Wing but his enthusiasm was infectious enough to make me believe that maybe my law degree and 8 years of corporate experience might be useful for something other than generating billable hours. "I want to help," I said, my hand shaking as I signed my name on a volunteer sheet that felt like a contract with destiny. My voice didn't shake. For the first time in months, my voice was steady as steel. What followed was a crash course in the difference between studying law and making it. I spent my days stapling flyers about affordable housing initiatives and pouring coffee for campaign staffers who were young enough to still believe that passion could overcome political reality. I answered phones and stuffed envelopes and knocked on doors in neighborhoods where people understood that voting wasn't just civic duty, it was survival strategy. But it was the nights that changed everything. After Emma went to bed, after I'd helped her with homework and read her the same 3 books she'd been requesting since kindergarten, I'd sit at that kitchen table and read policy briefs about labor rights by the glow of a laptop I couldn't afford to replace. The fluorescent light above our table flickered constantly, a dying bulb I kept meaning to change but never had the money for. It buzzed like an angry wasp, casting unstable shadows across pages that outlined exactly how the system was rigged against women like me. Federal laws that protected pregnant employees in theory but provided no enforcement mechanisms in practice. State regulations that allowed employers to fire workers for unreliable schedules without defining what reliability meant when your child had the flu. Local ordinances that protected businesses from discrimination lawsuits while offering workers nothing but the right to file complaints that would never be investigated. Each page I read made me angrier, but it was a focused anger now, surgical and precise. I wasn't just learning about problems anymore. I was cataloging solutions, understanding exactly which laws needed to be changed, and how those changes could happen. The flickering light buzzed above me like it was daring me to give up, to accept that some battles were too big for single mothers with law degrees and cardboard boxes full of broken dreams. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Because somewhere between the volunteer orientation and the third policy brief on family leave legislation, I'd realized something that Robert Morrison and every other powerful man who'd dismissed me had never understood. They'd thought they were ending my career when they fired me for being a mother. What they'd actually done was give me the time, motivation, and righteous fury necessary to learn how to end theirs. The system that had broken me was about to discover what happened when you gave a lawyer with nothing left to lose enough knowledge to break it right back. The community center on Pike Street smelled like industrial coffee and broken dreams, but it buzzed with the kind of electric tension that comes when people who've been silenced too long finally find their voices. 53 women packed into folding chairs arranged in a circle, their ages ranging from college students to grandmothers, their stories connected by the common thread of workplace discrimination that cut across every demographic line, like a virus that infected entire industries. Maria Santos had organized the forum as part of her city council campaign, calling it Voices for Change and promising a safe space for women to share experiences that employers preferred to keep buried in HR files and legal settlements. I'd volunteered to help with setup, expecting to arrange chairs and pour coffee, while more important people discussed policy. I hadn't expected to become part of the conversation. The first woman to speak was Jennifer Martinez, 32 years old, a software engineer who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times after returning from maternity leave. Her voice shook as she described supervisors who questioned her dedication and assigned her to projects that kept her invisible while male colleagues advanced past her like she was standing still. "They told me I was distracted," she said, her hands twisting a tissue into confetti, "because I had to leave at 6 to pick up my son from daycare. Never mind that I started work at 7 in the morning while they rolled in at 9. The second was Patricia Washington, 45, a nurse who'd been written up for attendance issues after taking time off to care for her diabetic daughter. Her supervisor had suggested that maybe she needed to reconsider her priorities and find a career that was more compatible with family obligations. Each story was a mirror reflecting my own humiliation. Every voice echoed the same dismissive attitudes, the same assumption that motherhood was a character flaw rather than a biological reality that half the human population navigated while trying to earn a living. By the time the 7th woman had shared her experience of being fired for pumping breast milk during breaks, I felt like I was drowning in the collective weight of systematic cruelty, disguised as business necessity. That's when Maria Santos walked over to where I was sitting in the back row, taking notes that I'd planned to type up for the campaign's newsletter. "Scarlett," she said, her voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who'd spent 15 years fighting battles like this. "Would you like to share your story?" The microphone she handed me felt like it weighed 50 pounds. My palms were instantly slick with sweat, my throat closing like someone was squeezing my windpipe. 53 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and for a moment I was back in Morrison's conference room, being told that my existence was incompatible with professional success. Then I saw Emma in the back corner where I'd set up a small area with crayons and coloring books for children who'd come with their mothers. She was concentrating on a drawing that appeared to be a purple dinosaur wearing a crown, her 7-year-old face serious with artistic effort. She was the reason I was here. She was the reason any of us were here. I cleared my throat and found my voice. "My name is Scarlett Hayes. 8 months ago, I was a senior associate at Morrison & Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms." My voice was stronger than I'd expected, carrying across the room without the microphone's amplification. I was fired because my boss decided that single mothers can't be fully committed to their jobs. The silence that followed was different from the polite attention the other speakers had received. This was the silence of people recognizing that what they were hearing was about to change everything. I spent 8 years working 60-hour weeks, missing Emma's school plays and birthday parties, believing that if I just worked harder than everyone else, eventually I'd be valued for my contribution instead of judged for my family situation. I looked around the room at faces that reflected my own journey, the exhaustion, the determination, the growing realization that individual solutions weren't enough to solve systematic problems. I was wrong. The system isn't broken by accident. It's designed to make women choose between financial security and family responsibilities, then punish us for whichever choice we make. My voice was getting stronger now, the legal training that had seemed useless for 8 months finally finding its purpose. But here's what Robert Morrison and every other boss who's ever made that choice for us doesn't understand. When you fire a woman for being a mother, you're not just ending one career. You're creating someone with nothing left to lose, and every reason to fight back. The silence broke like a dam bursting. Heads nodded throughout the room. Hands began to clap, tentatively at first, then with growing intensity. I saw reporters in the back scribbling notes, their faces showing the kind of attention that comes when someone realizes they're witnessing the beginning of something bigger than a campaign forum. "I'm here tonight because I'm tired of being told that motherhood is a liability instead of an asset. Tired of watching qualified women get pushed out of careers they've earned. Tired of a legal system that protects employers' right to discriminate more effectively than it protects workers' right to earn a living." The applause was sustained now, building like thunder before a storm. But more important than the sound was the feeling in that room, the electric recognition that individual stories had just become collective power. "For the first time in 8 months," I said, my voice carrying over the applause to reach every corner of that converted community center. "My voice isn't just mine, it's ours. And they're going to hear us." As I handed the microphone back to Maria Santos, I caught Emma's eye across the room. She was holding up her purple dinosaur drawing, pointing to the crown she'd carefully colored gold. "That's a queen dinosaur, Mommy," she called out, her voice cutting through the applause with the clarity that only children possess. "She's the strongest one in the whole world." For the first time since I'd been fired, I believed that might actually be true. The quiet revolution was about to get very loud. The decision to run for Washington State House of Representatives came 3 weeks after the Community Center Forum, when a video of my speech went viral and my phone started ringing with calls from women who'd seen themselves in my story. But viral videos don't pay rent, and righteous anger doesn't qualify you for office. What followed was 6 months of learning the difference between wanting to change the system and actually having the power to do it. The campaign began in my living room with a folding table, a laptop with a cracked screen, and Emma coloring campaign flyers while I tried to figure out how someone with no political experience and a negative bank balance could compete against incumbents with war chests and endorsements from people whose names appeared on hospital wings. My first speech at the Cascade Community Center was a disaster. Voice cracking with nerves, hands shaking so badly, I could barely hold my notes. I stumbled through talking points about workplace discrimination, while Emma sat in the front row, offering encouraging smiles that kept me from running off the stage. But I kept talking, kept showing up, kept knocking on doors in neighborhoods where people understood that politics wasn't abstract theory. It was whether you could afford groceries and childcare in the same month. Door-to-door canvassing in Seattle meant walking through rain that soaked through shoes I couldn't afford to replace, upstairs in apartment buildings where the elevators had been broken for months, talking to people who worked 3 jobs and still couldn't make ends meet. "I know you're busy," I'd say to exhausted parents juggling toddlers and grocery bags, "but I want to talk about making life easier for working families." Most people were too tired to care about politics. But enough of them had been fired for being pregnant, passed over for being mothers, or forced to choose between keeping their jobs and caring for sick children, that my story resonated in ways that carefully focus-grouped talking points never could. The late nights were the hardest part. After Emma went to sleep, I'd sit at that kitchen table under the still flickering fluorescent light, studying labor law and campaign finance regulations by the glow of my laptop. Emma would sometimes wake up and find me there at 2 a.m., curled up beside me with her stuffed elephant, asking sleepy questions about why Mommy was always working. "I'm trying to make things better," I'd whisper, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "For you and for all the other kids whose mommies have to work too hard." The debate stage at the Washington State Labor Council was where everything changed. Harsh television lights, 3 cameras, and an audience of union members who'd heard enough empty promises to fill a campaign graveyard. My opponent, incumbent Representative David Hoffman, had the backing of business groups and 20 years of experience explaining why change was impossible. "My opponent talks about protecting workers," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd never worried about paycheck-to-paycheck survival. "But her proposals would destroy small businesses and eliminate jobs." When it was my turn to respond, I looked out at faces that reflected my own journey, people who'd been told that their struggles were the price of economic progress, that their pain was necessary for someone else's profit. "If you call protecting women from workplace discrimination destroying business," I said, my voice steady for the first time since this campaign began, "then America has forgotten who built her. The women who worked in factories during World War II, the mothers who fought for the 8-hour workday, the daughters who broke glass ceilings so their children could dream bigger dreams." The applause wasn't polite political clapping. It was recognition, validation, the sound of people who'd been waiting decades for someone to speak their truth. But recognition didn't translate to money. My opponent had corporate donors writing 5-figure checks. I had working mothers showing up with casseroles for campaign volunteers, organizing babysitting shifts so other parents could phone bank, carpooling to voter registration drives in neighborhoods where every vote had to be earned. The headlines were brutal. Single mom overreaches, unqualified candidate promises impossible dreams, nanny running for nanny state. Each story was designed to remind voters that women like me didn't belong in positions of actual power, that our experiences were too limited, our perspectives too narrow, our priorities too emotional for the serious business of governance. I refused corporate donations, turned down PAC money, built a campaign funded by $20 donations from nurses and teachers and construction workers who understood that real change came from people, not checkbooks. Election night felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, watching results trickle in from precincts across a district that stretched from Seattle's working-class neighborhoods to suburban communities, where my story either resonated or represented everything they'd been taught to: fear about changing demographics. Emma sat on my lap in the campaign office, surrounded by volunteers who'd become extended family, watching returns on a borrowed television that got fuzzy reception when trucks drove past on the street outside. At 11:47 p.m., with 93% of precincts reporting, the Associated Press called the race. The screen flashed the words that would change everything: Scarlett Hayes, elected, Washington State House of Representatives. The room erupted in cheers that sounded like liberation, like vindication, like the collective exhale of people who'd been holding their breath for years waiting for this moment. Emma looked up at me with eyes that held her father's curiosity and her grandmother's wisdom, her 7-year-old voice cutting through the celebration with a question that made everything else fall silent. "Does this mean you won, Mommy?" I pulled her closer, feeling the weight of every door I'd knocked on, every law I'd studied, every night I'd chosen hope over fear and possibility over resignation. "No, baby," I whispered, loud enough for every volunteer in that room to hear. "It means we all did." The woman who'd been told she was too weak to be trusted with a job had just been trusted with the power to write the laws that would protect every woman who came after her. Morrison and Associates had created their own worst enemy, Now it was time to show them exactly how dangerous that enemy had become. The Washington State Capitol building had witnessed a lot of history, but I doubt it had ever seen a showdown quite like this one. The hearing room for the Labor and Commerce Committee was all marble pillars and mahogany panels, designed to remind everyone present that laws were serious business conducted by serious people in serious places. Cameras lined the back wall like a firing squad, their lenses focused on the witness table where corporate lobbyists would argue against the Women's Labor Protection Act, the bill I'd spent 18 months crafting, refining, and building support for. The air smelled like nervous sweat, fresh ink from reporters' notebooks, and the kind of tension that comes when powerful people realize their power is about to be challenged by someone they'd written off as powerless. But it was the man sitting across from me at the witness table who made this moment feel like destiny finally arriving to collect a debt. Robert Morrison looked exactly the same as he had 2 years ago when he'd fired me for being a mother, silver hair perfectly styled, expensive suit that whispered success to anyone who cared about such things. The kind of confident bearing that comes from never having to question whether you belong in rooms like this. He was here as a lobbyist for the Washington Business Coalition, paid handsomely to explain why protecting working mothers would somehow destroy the state's economy. His tie was adjusted with the precision of someone putting on armor before battle, his smile practiced enough to hide whatever he was really thinking about having to face the woman he'd dismissed as disposable. I felt the weight of every mother who'd ever been fired for being pregnant, every woman who'd been passed over for promotion because she had children, every parent who'd been forced to choose between keeping their job and caring for a sick child. Their stories lived in the pages of testimony I'd collected, their voices echoing in the legislative language I'd crafted to protect what should never have needed protection. Emma sat in the gallery with my mother, both of them wearing the kind of proud, nervous expressions that come with watching someone you love step into a moment that will define everything that comes after. Emma was 9 now, old enough to understand that today was important, smart enough to recognize the man who'd once made her mother cry. "Committee will come to order," announced Representative Williams, the committee chair whose support had been crucial in getting this bill to a hearing. "We're here to consider House Bill 2847, the Women's Labor Protection Act, which would prohibit employment discrimination based on pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical conditions." The procedural language made it sound routine, bureaucratic, just another bill in an endless stream of legislation. But everyone in that room understood this was bigger than policy. It was about whether women would be treated as equal participants in the workforce or permanent second-class citizens whose biology made them employment liabilities. Morrison spoke first, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent decades explaining why protecting workers would somehow hurt them. "While we all support women in the workplace," he began, his tone suggesting that any disagreement with his position was obviously unreasonable, this legislation would place an undue burden on small businesses, forcing them to accommodate employees whose reliability may be compromised by family obligations. The same language, the same assumptions, the same arrogant certainty that women's reproductive choices were character flaws that justified discrimination. When it was my turn to respond, I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this one, the cardboard box I'd carried out of Morrison and Associates, the nights I'd studied policy briefs while Emma slept beside me, the doors I'd knocked on in neighborhoods where my story wasn't unique, just louder than most. I held up the bill, 43 pages of legislative language that would rewrite the relationship between motherhood and employment in Washington state. "The Women's Labor Protection Act," I said, my voice carrying across that marble-lined chamber with the authority I'd earned through 2 years of learning how laws were made and power was wielded, "would establish clear protections for pregnant employees, mandate reasonable accommodations for nursing mothers, and provide enforcement mechanisms for discrimination complaints." But it was what came next that turned this hearing from policy discussion into something far more personal. 2 years ago, I continued, looking directly at Robert Morrison for the first time since I'd entered that room, the witness representing the business coalition fired me from my job at Morrison and Associates. Not for poor performance, my reviews were stellar. Not for misconduct, my record was spotless. He fired me because, in his words, "a single mom will never be fully committed to her job." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras clicked like machine gun fire as reporters realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a sitting legislator confronting the man who destroyed her career, armed with the power to prevent him from destroying anyone else's. That day, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, sitting in his conference room while he explained why motherhood made me unemployable, I made a vow. I promised myself that no woman would ever have to choose between financial security and family responsibility. That no employer would ever again have the legal right to fire someone for the crime of being pregnant. Morrison's jaw tightened, his practiced smile slipping for the first time since I'd known him. The confident bearing that had intimidated me for 8 years was cracking like cheap paint. Today, that vow becomes law. The applause started slowly, with a few scattered claps from the gallery where working mothers had taken time off jobs they couldn't afford to lose to witness this moment. Then it built, spreading through the hearing room like wildfire, drowning out the committee chair's attempts to restore order. I looked up at Emma in the gallery, her 9-year-old eyes shimmering with tears she didn't fully understand but felt in her bones. She was watching her mother transform the worst day of her career into the foundation for laws that would protect her generation. Morrison's hands gripped his briefcase like a life preserver. His face drained of the color that comes with realizing you've just watched someone you dismissed as powerless rewrite the rules that had protected your power. The committee will now vote, Representative Williams announced, but we all knew how this would end. The woman Robert Morrison had fired for being a mother was about to pass a law ensuring that no other woman would ever face that choice again. And he had to sit there and watch every minute of it. The vote was unanimous. 15 committee members from across Washington state advanced the Women's Labor Protection Act to the full legislature. But it wasn't the tally that mattered most, it was the silence that followed, the kind that comes when everyone realizes they've just witnessed history being written by someone no one expected to hold the pen. Robert Morrison packed his briefcase with mechanical precision, the smug confidence gone. No more dismissing women's concerns as overreaction. Only the realization that the employee he'd fired for being a mother was now the legislator who had made his discrimination illegal. The cameras trailed me out of the hearing room, flashes bouncing off marble walls that had seen governors fall and progress inch forward one vote at a time. Reporters shouted questions, but I barely heard them. All I saw was Emma, sprinting down the Capitol steps, her backpack bouncing, my mother chasing after her with spry but slower legs. "Mommy," Emma cried, throwing her arms around my waist with fierce relief. "You kept your promise." I knelt, holding the leather-bound bill in my hands, 43 pages of legal protection for women I'd never meet, children I'd never see, families I'd never know, but whose struggles I understood in my bones. "We kept our promise," I whispered back. The bill felt warm, like a shield forged from rejection letters, sleepless nights, and scars too deep to show. Proof that wounds can become weapons, defeats can lay the foundation for victories that reshape entire systems. Later, after interviews and a flood of emails from women across the state who had waited their entire careers for this moment, I stood on the Capitol steps watching the sun sink behind the Olympic Mountains. Emma held my hand as we both looked up at the Golden Dome. What had once felt intimidating now felt like home, not because I belonged to it, but because I had helped shape what it could become. "They tried to fire me from my future," I said into the evening air. "Instead, they lit the fire that forged it." Emma looked up at me, her 9-year-old face serious. "What's next, Mommy?" I thought of the women still told they were too emotional for leadership, too unreliable for promotion, too distracted by family obligations to be trusted with real power. I thought of the girls who would grow up in a world where pregnancy wasn't a career death sentence, where motherhood was respected, where competence, not family status, defined worth. "Everything," I answered, squeezing her hand. "We change everything." The Capitol dome glowed as we walked to the parking lot where my battered Honda waited. That car had carried us through unemployment, campaigning, and the long road from fired employee to elected official. But I was no longer the woman escorted out of Morrison and Associates with a cardboard box and a broken heart. I wasn't even the woman who had first volunteered for a campaign out of anger. I was someone who had learned that power isn't granted by being invited to the table. Power is built, law by law, vote by vote, by those who refuse to stay silent, when silence means accepting injustice. Power comes from knowing your story isn't just yours, it belongs to millions told they don't matter, don't belong, don't have the right to decide. And real power is turning those shared stories into laws that protect everyone who follows. Driving home through Seattle traffic, Emma dozed in the back seat, clutching the commemorative pen I'd used to sign the bill that would carry her name into history books. The radio played coverage of the vote, but I turned it down, preferring the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd kept the promise I'd made to myself 2 years earlier. Robert Morrison had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a cautionary tale about ambition and motherhood. Instead, he gave me the fuel to rewrite the ending for everyone. The woman he fired for being a mother had become the legislator who made it illegal to fire anyone else for the same reason. And that was a story worth fighting for. Scarlett's story isn't just about political revenge or workplace justice. It's about the moment you realize that individual solutions aren't enough to solve systematic problems. That sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to change the laws that failed to protect you in the first place. If this story reminded you of your own workplace struggles, if it made you think about someone whose potential has been wasted by outdated attitudes, hit that like button and subscribe. Turn on notifications because next week we're exploring another story about quiet persistence and explosive transformation. Share this with someone who needs to remember that being discarded by the old system doesn't disqualify you from building a better one. Remember, they can fire you from your job, but they can't fire you from your purpose. And sometimes the greatest revenge is not getting even, it's making sure the injustice you faced becomes impossible for anyone else to experience. Until next time, keep building the world you want your children to inherit.